Do you know, according to today's latest news, somewhere in the narrow channel between Iran and Oman, a stretch of water barely 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, a tanker captain checks his position, checks his insurance coverage, and checks it again. He is about to sail through the single most valuable strip of ocean on Earth. And, for months now, that decision has not been a formality. It has been a gamble. Every year before this crisis, roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas passed through this one gap in the coastline. A bottleneck so narrow that a handful of missiles, mines, or drones could, in theory, choke the global economy. For decades, that theory stayed a theory. Then, earlier this year, it stopped being one. Warships moved in. Commercial insurers pulled out. And a shipping lane that the modern world had quietly assumed would always stay open suddenly became a battlefield. What happened here did not begin with a tanker. It began somewhere else entirely, and the way it started explains almost everything about why it has been so difficult to stop. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, flanked by Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. Its shipping lanes are so tight that inbound and outbound tankers are funneled into channels only a few kilometers wide, passing within sight of Iranian territorial waters, whether they want to or not. That geography has made the strait a source of leverage for Tehran for nearly half a century, ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 turned the country into a persistent rival of the United States and its regional partners. Every major disruption in the strait, going back to the so-called tanker war of the 1980s, when American warships escorted reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through these same waters, has followed the same basic logic. Control the choke point, and you control a piece of the global economy. That earlier conflict ended in a one-day naval battle between the U.S. Navy and Iranian forces, and in one of the most sobering accidents of the Cold War era, the accidental shooting down of an Iranian passenger jet by an American warship, killing 290 people aboard. That history sat quietly in the background for decades. This year, it stopped being history and became precedent. The current crisis traces to February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign of airstrikes against Iranian military targets. Among the targets was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the operation. It was one of the most consequential single strikes in the modern history of the Middle East, and it triggered an immediate response from Tehran that had nothing to do with missiles fired back at Israel or Washington. Instead, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps went straight for the world's oil supply. Within hours, the IRGC began transmitting warnings over marine radio to every vessel in or approaching the strait, declaring that no ship would be permitted to pass. Britain's Royal Navy noted publicly that the closure had no legal standing under international maritime law, but law and practice are different things when warships and mines are involved, and shipping companies do not gamble $100 million vessels on a legal technicality. Within a single day, oil tanker traffic through the strait collapsed by roughly 86%. Within the opening weeks, overall tanker transits fell by about 70%, and more than 150 vessels sat anchored outside the strait, waiting for a war to end before they would risk the passage. To understand why a single strike thousands of kilometers from any oil tanker could paralyze global shipping within hours, it helps to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, mechanically. It is not simply open ocean. Inbound and outbound traffic is separated into two lanes, each roughly 3 kilometers wide, divided by a 2-kilometer buffer zone, all of it squeezed into a channel that narrows to about 30. 3 kilometers between the Iranian coastline and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman. There is no practical alternative route for most of the tankers loading crude in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. A small number of pipelines exist that can move limited volumes of Saudi and Emirati oil overland to ports on the Red Sea or the Gulf of Oman, bypassing the strait entirely, but their combined capacity covers only a fraction of what normally transits Hormuz by sea. That structural dependency is precisely what has made the waterway such an effective lever for Tehran in past standoffs, and it is what transformed a political assassination into an immediate physical threat to the world's energy supply within the same news cycle. The waiting did not stay passive for long. On March 11th, less than 2 weeks into the crisis, the Thai-flagged bulk carrier Mayuri Narelle came under attack while transiting the strait after leaving a port in the United Arab Emirates. Video released by Thailand's Navy showed thick black smoke pouring from the vessel as crew were evacuated by life raft. On the same day, the U.S. Pentagon announced that American forces had destroyed 16 Iranian boats it said were laying naval mines inside the strait, a claim that, if accurate, meant Iran was not simply threatening to block the waterway rhetorically, but attempting to seed it with explosives capable of sinking any ship that struck one. Days earlier, the tanker Skylight, flying the flag of Palau and already under U.S. sanctions as part of what Washington calls Iran's shadow fleet for illegally moving Iranian oil, was targeted a few miles north of Oman's Kasab port. All 20 crew members were evacuated, and at least 4 were injured. No one claimed responsibility, but the Gulf Cooperation Council condemned what it called Iranian attacks on shipping near Oman's coast, and Western officials were already treating Iranian involvement as the working assumption, even where formal proof had not been made public. The economic ripple was immediate and global. As tanker traffic collapsed, oil futures markets reopened to talk of Brent crude testing $100 a barrel, a level not seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Analysts at major banks explicitly raised their price forecasts to that threshold, warning that a prolonged closure could remove as much as 20 million barrels a day from global supply, representing roughly a fifth of the world's output. 8 OPEC-plus nations convened an emergency virtual meeting to assess the fallout. Marine insurers, the invisible gatekeepers of global shipping, began halting coverage for voyages through the strait altogether, which meant that even ship owners willing to risk the physical danger faced the prospect of sailing completely uninsured, exposed to catastrophic financial loss if anything went wrong. Some very large crude carriers turned back mid-voyage rather than accept that risk. It was, in the span of about 2 weeks, the sharpest disruption to a critical global choke point in decades, and it was only the beginning. The vessels caught in the crossfire were not a random sample of world shipping either, and that detail matters for understanding who Iran appeared to be targeting. Several of the earliest ships hit, including the Skylight, were already under U.S. Treasury sanctions, as part of what American officials call Iran's shadow fleet. Tankers used to move Iranian crude around Western sanctions through ship-to-ship transfers and falsified documentation. Whether Tehran's forces were deliberately punishing vessels tied to its own sanctions, evasion network for straying too close to routes it did not control, or simply striking at any traffic that ignored its declared closure, regardless of ownership, was not something Iranian officials clarified publicly. What was clear was Iran's insistence, repeated by its Revolutionary Guard commanders in state media interviews, that only a single, narrow corridor hugging Iran's own coastline would be considered safe, and that any vessel using the traditional route closer to Oman's shore was moving at its own risk. That single policy decision, more than any individual strike, is what forced insurers, ship owners, and eventually foreign navies into the elaborate, dangerous choreography that would define the rest of the year. A fight not just over whether the strait would stay open, but over who got to decide which few kilometers of water counted as open at all. What followed was not a single war, but a stuttering, months-long cycle of escalation, threat, brief truce, and collapse. One that reveals just how difficult it is to actually close a deal once a choke point war like this has started. In mid-April, the United States imposed a formal naval blockade on Iranian ports, a posture that lasted roughly 6 weeks. President Trump, meanwhile, issued a string of escalating public warnings. On April 7th, he said that a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not agree to end the fighting and reopen the strait. Hours later, a 2-week ceasefire was announced. On April 21st, the day before that truce was due to expire, Trump said he expected to be bombing again if no deal was reached, then extended the ceasefire anyway. On May 17th, he warned Iran that the clock was ticking and there would soon be nothing left of the country if it did not move faster, only to say the next day that he would hold off on further strikes at the request of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, 3 Gulf states with enormous financial exposure to a wider war. On June 11th, Trump announced plans to hit Iran very hard that night, including striking Karg Island, one of Iran's most important oil export terminals, then abruptly canceled the strikes hours later, saying the final details of a new agreement had come together. It was a pattern that would repeat again and again through the year. Maximum threat, sudden reprieve, incomplete resolution. Regional governments spent these same months in an uncomfortable position, caught between a superpower ally threatening to widen the war and their own direct exposure to whatever happened next in waters they depend on as much as anyone. When the United States floated striking an array of Iranian bridges, power plants, and other civilian infrastructure in mid-May, it was reportedly Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, 3 of the Gulf's wealthiest and most exposed economies, that pushed Washington to hold off, a request Trump said publicly he had honored. Their concern was straightforward. All 3 sit within range of Iranian retaliation. All 3 depend heavily on the same shipping lane for their own energy exports, and all 3 had watched insurance markets and oil-dependent budgets absorb months of volatility already. NATO allies, for their part, had made their position clear even earlier in the conflict. When Trump called in mid-March for nations receiving oil through Hormuz to help secure the passage militarily, Germany, Spain, Italy, Estonia, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union collectively declined, leaving the burden of military escort and enforcement almost entirely on the United States and its most immediate regional partners. That June agreement produced the closest thing to a breakthrough the crisis has seen. On June 17th, a memorandum of understanding was signed, restoring a ceasefire and setting the stage for one of the more remarkable operations of the entire episode, a coordinated evacuation, organized jointly by the International Maritime Organization and the government of Oman, to rescue mariners who had been effectively trapped aboard their vessels for weeks. Ships were guided out through Omani waters, deliberately routed south of both Iranian territorial waters and the traditional Hormuz shipping lanes, in an effort to keep them clear of the conflict entirely. Crossings through the strait ticked upward in the following days, though never close to pre-war volumes. For a brief window, it looked as though the worst of the crisis might be behind the world. It was not. On June 25th, just over a week after the evacuation began, Iran struck a vessel operating in Omani waters, prompting immediate American airstrikes in response and effectively announcing that the June truce would not hold either. The most serious test came in early July. On the 7th and 8th of that month, a fresh wave of Iranian attacks struck vessels off the coast of Oman, and by the UN, International Maritime Organization's own count, it was the most attacks recorded in a single day since late April. 3 ships were hit within hours of each other. One, a liquefied natural gas tanker, caught fire after what Iranian state television described as ignoring prior warnings, though Tehran stopped short of formally claiming responsibility for the strike itself. The other 2 vessels sustained damage but were able to continue their voyages, and no crew members were reported injured. The United States responded on 2 fronts at once, with further airstrikes against Iranian targets, and with an economic countermeasure that received far less attention but carried real weight, revoking a 60-day Treasury license that had authorized limited sales of Iranian oil as part of the unraveling interim deal. President Trump declared the Memorandum of Understanding no longer in effect. By the middle of July, the volume of attacks and counterattacks, Iranian strikes on shipping and regional targets, met by American strikes on Iran, had climbed higher than at any point since the war's opening weeks in late February, and cross-strait shipping traffic collapsed once again in response. The human and material toll of 5 months of intermittent warfare in and around the strait accumulated steadily, even as headlines moved on to the next round of talks. By the most recent independent tallies, at least 17 merchant vessels have been damaged badly enough to require evacuation or abandonment, at least 7 of them abandoned outright, alongside 2 ships captured and a tugboat sunk entirely. 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing across the various incidents, and in Bahrain, a port worker was killed and 2 others wounded in an attack that showed the danger was no longer confined to open water, but had reached the docks themselves. The United States, for its part, reimposed its naval blockade after the collapse of the June ceasefire, and U.S. Central Command has said that under that blockade it redirected 44 commercial vessels away from the area, disabled 2 others, and boarded 2 more. Whatever the eventual outcome of the diplomacy, the strait by midsummer had become something closer to a contested military zone than a commercial shipping lane, patrolled and fought over rather than simply crossed. Not every dramatic incident in these waters, it is worth noting, turned out to be an act of war. On June 17th, the same day the ceasefire memorandum was signed, 2 oil tankers, the Adelan and the Front Eagle, collided in the strait, with a fire breaking out aboard the Front Eagle roughly 15 nautical miles off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. British maritime security monitor Ambry assessed the collision as unrelated to the surrounding conflict. An ordinary accident of the kind that happens periodically in one of the world's busiest and most congested waterways, even in peacetime. The distinction mattered enormously for markets and militaries trying to track the war in real time, and it points to a recurring difficulty of covering this crisis honestly. With tension this high and reporting this fragmented, not every explosion, fire, or collision in the strait has a confirmed cause, and misinformation has followed the real attacks closely. Fact-checkers have had to debunk viral images, including a photograph of a decades-old tanker sinking off Italy in 1991 that was repeatedly recirculated on social media and falsely captioned as a fresh Iranian drone strike on an American vessel, a reminder that the fog around this conflict extends well beyond the battlefield itself. By early August, something did shift, though how far it shifted remains genuinely unresolved. Iran and Oman entered direct talks aimed specifically at the strait, and by the first week of the month, Tehran's state media reported that the 2 sides had agreed on coordinates for a new shipping route and were finalizing arrangements to jointly manage vessel movements through the waterway. Crucially, Iranian officials were careful to draw a sharp distinction. This was described as an agreement on how ships would move, not a reopening of the strait to unrestricted international traffic, and certainly not an end to the broader standoff with Washington. Iran's parliament confirmed that the talks concerned navigation and vessel movement specifically, while its foreign ministry said route coordinates had been finalized and technical arrangements for joint management of the passage were being completed. Oil markets responded to the uncertainty exactly as they had all year, Brent crude, which had fallen under $80 a barrel over 3 consecutive days as hopes grew, jumped nearly 4% in a single session once it became clear that any Iran-Oman arrangement would fall well short of a genuine reopening. Qatar publicly voiced support for the Oman-Iran process, with a foreign ministry spokesman describing a ceasefire that guarantees freedom of navigation and a return to negotiations as the only realistic way forward, underscoring just how much the wider Gulf region has staked on an outcome it does not fully control. That fragile optimism did not last through the month. By the middle of August, the diplomatic picture had darkened again. A separate 60-day ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, one that had briefly stabilized the broader conflict beyond shipping, was set to expire without any deal in sight, and ship traffic through the strait sank to a new low based on independent tracking data. President Trump, in a television interview, said the United States would, in his words, bomb Oman if the Gulf Sultanate got in the way of American operations in the strait, a remarkable threat against a country that had spent months trying to broker peace between Washington and Tehran. He said he was in no hurry to make a deal, describing Iranian negotiators as skilled but ultimately losing ground. Within days, Trump stated flatly that no formal talks with Iran were underway at all, even as the United Arab Emirates reported detecting a missile threat, a reminder that the shooting war, not just the shipping dispute, remained live. Iran, for its part, continued to insist that no negotiations were happening directly with Washington, framing its only active diplomacy as the narrower discussion with Oman over navigation routes, a discussion its own officials repeatedly stressed would not amount to reopening the strait to the world. What remains genuinely uncertain, even now, is whether any of this adds up to an off-ramp or simply a pause between rounds. The pattern established since February has been strikingly consistent: threat, brief ceasefire, incomplete implementation, renewed attack, and another round of talks that produces partial, technical progress rather than a comprehensive resolution. Analysts tracking the region have noted that the current lull could persist for as long as both Washington and Tehran judge that they can absorb the military and economic costs of an effectively closed strait, and that the alternative, for the United States at least, is not necessarily to force the strait open, but to accelerate efforts to reroute global shipping around it entirely, a shift that would carry its own permanent costs for global energy markets even after the fighting eventually stops. Whether Iran's calculation changes if a Hormuz-adjacent deal with Oman actually holds, whether the 60-day ceasefire's expiration triggers another spike in attacks, and whether Trump's threats against Oman are rhetorical pressure or a genuine warning of strikes on a third country entirely, are all questions without confirmed answers as of this moment. What can be said with confidence is narrower and in some ways more unsettling. For the first time in decades, a war between two nations has repeatedly and deliberately spilled into the arteries of global trade itself, not as an accident of geography, but as a calculated instrument of pressure used by more than one side again and again for the better part of a year. The last time the world watched a conflict like this play out in these same waters in the 1980s, it ended not with a negotiated triumph, but with an accidental tragedy. A passenger jet mistaken for a threat and shot out of the sky, killing everyone aboard. That history does not predict what happens next in 2026, but it does explain why so many governments, insurers, and shipping companies have spent the past 5 months treating every fragile ceasefire with the same wary caution. Not because peace seems impossible, but because in the Strait of Hormuz, it has never once come easily, and it has never once come for free. What the past 6 months have demonstrated, more clearly than any single battle or ceasefire, is that a modern war no longer needs to touch a battlefield to touch everyone. It can move through an oil futures contract in London, an insurance premium calculated in a Lloyd's underwriting office, a fuel bill paid by a trucking company that has never heard of the Strait of Hormuz, and a container of goods delayed by weeks because the ship carrying it chose the long way around Africa instead. The strait itself is barely visible on most world maps, a thin blue seam between two coastlines, and yet for 5 months it has functioned as one of the clearest pressure points on the entire global economy, precisely because so few alternatives exist to replace it. The tanker captain checking his position at the start of this story is still out there tonight, somewhere between Oman's coastline and Iran's, and whether his next voyage through that gap in the map is routine or catastrophic may depend less on the sea in front of him than on decisions being made, right now, in rooms thousands of miles away, by men who have shown repeatedly that they are willing to let the world's shipping lanes absorb the cost of a war that began somewhere else entirely.